So welcome everyone. Very nice to meet you, at least digitally meet you. My name is David Koenig. I run an organization called the DCRO Risk Governance Institute. We are a very happy client of PCL with Elliot, Jeff, Chloe, Anna, everyone we've worked with there. We've had such a great relationship. And part of it is that I'll talk more about in my presentation because this notion of the psychology of risk, this is something that's been important to me since I started my career, which now is pretty close to 40 years ago. So with that, let me start my introduction. Or start my presentation. I'm going to share my screen. We'll just make sure that it's showing up okay there before I get going.
Yep, super. We can see it all.
Good. Okay. So let me just make one quick change here so I can see what I'm about to say to you guys. Anyway, great to be with you digitally. Sometime Chloe and I were just talking about my needing to get over to London to be with you in person, which I really hope to do sometime fairly soon. But our job today, or what I hope today to do, is to talk to you about how risk impacts the work of boards of directors. And if you're not familiar with what boards of directors do, don't worry. That's the first part of my presentation, is to talk to you about their duties and how risk impacts their performance and what we try to do as an organization, both as the Institute and also working with the Risk Type Compass and PCL to help in that board performance. So I have a few goals for today's session. The first one is I want to review the board's role as it relates to risk. And so this is something called risk governance. We'll get into that a little bit more in just a bit so that you get an understanding about what the term governance means, what risk governance means, how it's slightly different, but how it impacts all of what the board does. And we're going to go through something called the Successful Director's Hierarchy of Needs. This is something I developed a few years back as a way to help people understand how it is they might advance in their careers to serve on boards of directors. For a lot of people, the culmination of a very successful executive career is to serve on boards of directors. It's not an easy thing to get. It's not an easy thing to achieve. So we try to help people understand what differentiates them. And one of those things, as you'll see, is an understanding of how risk impacts the way in which we work with others. In general, and I'm sure you've talked a lot about this already today, we want to look at how risk impacts the way in which groups work. So boards of directors are a small group of people. We want to understand the role that risk plays in helping them fulfill their duties and their obligations. And then we're going to look at group risk personalities and how that impacts board performance. And then also look at how we might take specific duties that a board has and analyze risk personalities individually and collectively to help the board be more effective. So getting back to that point I made earlier, what is a board of directors? Now, a board of directors is a group that's appointed really as a representative. They're usually elected or appointed to represent the owners or the funders or the stakeholders of some organization. This can be a for-profit company, a nonprofit, it can be a government enterprise, it can be a neighborhood community, a housing association. There are all sorts of things that have boards of directors. But these are the first agents. So when we refer to an agent, we're talking about someone who has the responsibility of representing someone who's not present on a daily basis. So the owners of organizations, the funders of nonprofits are usually not there on a day-to-day basis. So they have agents who represent them. They're supposed to make sure that this organization is operating in their best interests, trying to create value as it's defined by the owners or ultimately by this board of directors. Well, boards of directors are also not there on a daily basis. So their job is to oversee what we call the management of an organization or the enterprise and how it runs. So the difference when we talk about governance versus management is that a board is setting this foundation, setting this infrastructure, making sure that it's running properly so that those who are there on a day-to-day basis are working to make the best outcome that they can in alignment with what the owners, funders, stakeholders have said is important to them. So that's their legal duty. They actually have a legal fiduciary duty in most places to do this well. So let's look at those a little bit more specifically. Usually in tandem with the management of the company, the board of directors will set the strategy and the goal for the organizations. These might be 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10-year objectives that are set. It's becoming more and more difficult to set those long-term objectives given all the disruption that's going on in the markets today, but that's something they're charged with doing. It is one of the primary tasks of a board of directors. But since they're not there on a day-to-day basis, they have to empower someone who is. And the main report to a board of directors from that management team is the chief executive officer. So they have three duties with the chief executive officer. One is to find the first one, right? To hire the chief executive officer. As soon as that chief executive officer is hired, it's to plan for the succession to the next chief executive officer. Now that could come about because people, have accidents or health things, something where they leave for a new job, something that might be an emergency succession, or more likely something that's planned out over time so that we have smooth transitions in organizations. And then they have to evaluate whether the current chief executive officer is someone who's fulfilling their expectations. They're also responsible for overseeing the culture of an organization, whether that's in alignment with the values of the founders or the funders or the owners, compliance with rules and regulations, and really asking whether the operations of the organization, whether it's structured properly, to do its best job. So these are three main tasks that a board has that anyone who's outside looking in will analyze this for their effectiveness. Now, there are a couple of legal duties which are common across most economies, most Western legal systems. The first one is a duty of loyalty. This duty of loyalty means that board members are expected to represent the company's interests, not their personal interests. So they're not supposed to work with competitors. They're not supposed to make decisions that benefit themselves personally. They're supposed to be making decisions that benefit the organization's value overall. That's that duty of loyalty. It's a pretty rare thing to see somebody breach that, but it can be breached. I've seen it personally. The one that we pay most attention to in our work is something called the duty of care. Now, this, as you think about the word care, it's what you would expect. It's that you are being careful in your work, that you're putting the right amount of time into it so that you can fulfill this legal obligation and the expectations of those who have put you in a position as a board member. We'll go into the duty of care a little bit more detail in just a bit. But these are the things that when you say, well, what does a board do? And these are the things that best capture the responsibility of a board of directors. Now, boards have a lot of work that they have to do, and they don't meet that often. So part of what a board does is to divvy up the duties, specific duties that are required, into board committees. So we have a board as a whole, the whole group that meets, and then we have subcommittees or committees of the board that meet. We're going to go over a couple of the most common ones that you see. An audit committee is found in just about every board. An audit committee is responsible for making sure that the representations the company is making are valid. So, for example, if financial statements are put out, if it's saying it's in compliance with various laws, rules, regulations, the audit committee's job is to hire external auditors to make sure that the internal audit practices are such that they, the owners, and the external market, the stakeholders, can have confidence that what the company is saying is accurate. So it's a very backward-looking, validating approach. So the type of person you want in this is very detail-oriented, somebody who thinks that process is very important. We have compensation and remuneration committees. So remuneration is a term you're probably more familiar with in the UK for this. This is the committee that sets generally the compensation practices for the senior executive team, but it can also structure the compensation culture for the organization. So how is it that we're paying people? What are we paying them to do? What are we incenting people to do? And is that aligned with what the values and goals are of the organization? Some companies, not all, have risk committees. Sometimes they include this risk committee as part of the audit committee. So you might see an audit and risk committee. It's something that we don't advocate for because, as I mentioned, audit is backward-looking and validating. Risk is forward-looking and anticipatory. So we'll often hear about risk being talked about with things that can go wrong. We're going to go in a little bit more detail in a bit about why that's problematic. But we try to focus on risk as this anticipatory notion and something that we have to do. So we have a risk committee to help us understand the environment in which we're operating, the things that we should be doing, maybe things that we shouldn't be doing, and whether we're charging people properly for the risk that they're taking. A nomination and governance committee is responsible for identifying board members. And usually that's to replace someone who's retiring from the board, or it also has the duty of asking some board members to step down if they're not appropriate for the current situation that the company or organization finds itself facing, or maybe they're not up to standards in terms of what's being expected by their fellow board members. So a nomination governance committee is also looking at things like diversity on the boards, whether they have the right skill mix. And this is a long process. You might see 1 to 2 years of work in identifying future board members. But board members don't change over very often. Maybe there's a 9-member board, maybe one board seat comes open each year, maybe two, but it's pretty rare to see much more than that. Because people enjoy their board service, people tend to be good at it, but we're always thinking about how it is that we can refresh our boards, and that's where a nomination governance committee comes in. Fewer places have something called an innovation committee, but it's becoming more and more important as technology makes the changing business environment very rapid. It's very easy to be innovated out of a competitive position. So we see more and more of these. Is the company experimenting enough? Is it taking enough innovation? Cybersecurity and technology, of course, we hear more about cyber risks. We've heard more about those for probably a decade. But now there are legal expectations from regulators that boards have cyber experts or people with cyber risk governance knowledge on their boards. And the technology committee can cover that, as also whether they're using technology well in terms of innovation. So there's some overlap with that innovation committee. If you're involved in things like mining or healthcare, you might have a human safety committee. This may be priority number one for you. You might have a zero tolerance for risk to human life. We hope that's the case. But human safety committees are more prevalent in the kinds of organizations that I mentioned. And if you're on a nonprofit board or some for-profit boards, you'll see a finance committee, executive committee, which is the leadership of the board, fundraising, and other types of committees. All of these committees have some overlap. They have some need to coordinate with each other. So you'll often see members of each of these committees sitting in as ex officio members on meetings of the other committees, particularly things like audit and risk. But they all have one thing in common. Risk touches everything they do. So there is no work that a board does that a conversation about risk doesn't impact their discussion. It's going to be considered in different ways in these places, but the committee I have listed up here, risk impacts what they do. So that makes it pretty important to be thinking about how our perceptions of risk impact how we work. Now, the organization I run, we're a nonprofit. We're what's called a 501c3 in the United States. That's actually a charity. It's an educational institution. We are a peer-led organization. So all of our programs are taught by board members and C-suite executives. We teach board members and C-suite executives in different parts of the world. Right now, we have credential holders serving on boards in over 60 countries on 6 different continents. So we have a very diverse representation across our faculty and our graduates. We've been very happy with that. Enjoying some great partnerships with groups like the New York Stock Exchange, the IFC, and other entities that are trying to bring forward these notions that we've been talking about here. We teach that risk-taking is necessary. In other words, we don't teach that risk is about everything that can go wrong. We don't teach you that you should be afraid to try things because it just might not work out. We say you have to try things. How do you try them the best way? And that's what we try to do in terms of the work of those committees that I just mentioned. We try to teach what's called the positive governance of risk-taking. So again, saying that we need to take risk in order to survive and thrive. How do we put that in a positive framing as opposed to this framing around loss? So how is it that we talk about risk in terms of achieving goals, which is what most board members are very comfortable with, because to get to a place where you're serving on a board, you've usually been very good at achieving goals. You've been very successful in your career. So as I mentioned, it's a really difficult environment right now. I'm going to go into that in more detail in just a bit, but we want people to learn to embrace that. If you're faced with a lot of risk, a lot of times we get to this position where we're afraid, we're stopped, we don't think well, and we'll talk about that in more detail, but we want to teach you to be comfortable with risk so that you can learn to embrace it. And then finally, we help people trying to find those board seats. So we help them understand what it is that's valuable, how it is that their background can impact boards, how it is that they can bring that expertise and experience that they have to make the world a better place or the organization a better place, whatever it is that you hope to serve. So a few years back, I created this thing called the Successful Director's Hierarchy of Needs. I think most of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if you remember, the first level of Maslow's hierarchy is food, water, shelter, the basics just to live. In our world, in the Successful Director's Hierarchy of Needs, it's everything you've done in your career. It's all of your professional and academic education. It's all of the successes you've had. It's all of the networks that you've built. And if you can imagine, people who are thinking about serving on boards generally have been very successful in their work. they're sometimes surprised to learn that that's food, water, and shelter. That's the starting point. It's really difficult to be selected to serve on a board. So you have to start asking yourself, what else can I do to distinguish myself to get that role? And when I do have that role, what else can I do to be more effective in the boardroom? So we encourage people to do governance credentialing to teach them how boards work effectively. We have the qualified risk director designation. That's one way we help distinguish people. Then in the third level of this, we try to teach people or help people find resources to help them communicate what they can do to help with boards. But then I'll take you to the fourth level very quickly, which is what PCL works a lot on. And this is where our overlap with them has been very helpful. We want you to understand how to be emotionally intelligent in the boardroom. We want to help you understand your risk personality, the risk personalities of others in the room, how it's going to impact the way you can be effective in the boardroom, because it's really difficult to get in the boardroom. But once you're in, if your fellow board members respect you and enjoy working with you, they're going to recommend you for other boards. And so we want you to be effective in understanding things like how it is you're perceived by others or how it is that risk impacts you. Because again, remember, risk impacts every single thing a board does. We want you to understand how you can be more effective with that knowledge. So that's our successful director's hierarchy of needs. It doesn't really guarantee you're going to get a board seat. It's probably one of the most difficult things you'll ever try to pursue to get, but we hope that this helps. So now governance, as I'd mentioned earlier, is what a board does. It's creating a framework. Management is what the CEO, the executives, and all the workers in the company do. Risk governance is slightly different. Risk governance focuses on this role of risk taking. So I've already alluded to quite a bit of that in terms of how it impacts the different committees, how it is that we try to teach about this. But really, we're saying everything you do is about risk taking. Regardless, I mean, it could be your decision where to eat dinner tonight. That's risk taking. How do you create the environment for a whole organization of very different people with different goals, different objectives, different skill sets? How do you create the environment that they can be most effective at taking risk? And that's what we call risk governance. So a little bit different from corporate governance, which you may have heard as a term, because corporate governance tends to have more of the legal aspects to it. So that duty of care, duty of loyalty, the committee structures, all of those things. Risk governance is about creating an environment. So I often talk about organizations as complex adaptive systems or even living entities. This is about creating the environment in which that entity lives most effectively. Excuse me. So now I talked to you about earlier, this being a difficult environment. And if you look on the left of my screen, I would say it's fair to say that this is the most challenging environment that board members have ever faced in their careers. And most of these people are going to have worked 30 or 40 years. But I'll also say it's probably the easiest environment they're going to face the rest of their careers. So those of you in the room who are mid-career, earlier in your career, just know that if this stuff all seems challenging right now, it is. And just know that investing in what you're doing today is going to help you because this environment is not going to get easier. It's going to be more difficult. So we're all facing big challenges. Now, some of those are the ones I have listed on this screen. Inflation, central bank policies, which you might remember were easing and tightening. Depends where you are in the world, what the level of inflation is that you're facing. It might be 2%, it might be 80%. There are more debts being taken on by different entities, financial institutions, corporations, governments. We're socializing risk more than we used to. Through the pandemic, we certainly socialize things, but we also see that with business failures. This is stuff that creates a different set of things that we're having to deal with strategically when we do that strategic planning. But as you guys know there, as you've just seen here in the US, as we see in different parts of the world, geopolitics is starting to play an even bigger role, particularly when you see dramatic whipsaw in political philosophies. I mean, in the US, I don't think we could have gone through a more dramatic whipsaw in political philosophies over the last 8 years, maybe even last 12 years. That makes it very difficult for people to do long-range planning. But we have things like the environment that are impacting geopolitics. As climate risk becomes more of an issue, and as we see it appear in our daily lives more, we recognize that it's impacting things like migration. We realize it's impacting our food supply. We know that it's exacerbating these geopolitical trends. The COP conference that just finished, there was $300 billion a year pledged, and a lot of countries said that's not enough. So this is stuff that makes it, again, harder for us all to be operating. And then we throw on top of that how quickly technology is changing. Not just ChatGPT when it came out, but quantum computing as we move to faster ways of communicating with each other. As we've seen in war, the use of drones. If you don't understand how complex adaptive systems work, what you're starting to see with this drone warfare is that kind of autonomous communication where there's adaptation taking place without human intervention. And AI is making that even more possible. So now we have these questions about skill obsolescence. Are people who are working in low-tech and high-tech jobs more likely to be replaced by these emerging technologies? And I can tell you, it's certainly not just low-skill jobs. I know of some PhDs who've been replaced recently by AIs. And that's pretty unsettling to people. So again, this human capital idea of not knowing what's certain about our future, not just individually, but as a corporation. Where is it that you're going to invest in human capital development, retention, recruitment? And how is that changing? Is there a difference? I have kids who are 24 and 22. Is there a difference culturally between how they view work and what people like my age view work? How do you handle that transition? And of course, we've gone through the pandemic. But part of the climate change exacerbation of some of these risks is that there are novel viruses and novel bacterias that are resistant to the treatments we have today that are emerging in more and more places. So we're facing a really difficult environment. And on top of that, we have the usual bugaboo, which is competition. That's something we've always had to face in the board. But imagine yourself with all of these things being responsible for planning out your 1, 3, 5, 10-year strategic objectives. And all of this stuff is making it more difficult for you to think forward. So we have that legal obligation I mentioned before, the duty of care. You have to be prudent. You have to be vigilant in what you do. You have to demonstrate that you're thinking about all of those things that I just mentioned. If you don't meet that standard, you might have legal liability. In the UK, there's personal liability for directors. In many places, we offer directors and officers insurance to help protect against when things go badly, but you're not protected if you haven't done the work. And then we all have a moral responsibility. So all of us look to our leaders to say, you guys should be responsible for what you're doing. You also have a responsibility outside of your corporate walls to those who are impacted by what you do. So this is what comprises this duty of care. When anybody's evaluating whether a board has done a good job, it often goes to this duty of care, not just outcomes. Did they follow good process? Did they show that they cared? Boards are small groups. They're often no more than 7 to 9 people. You'll see on some public companies or universities or other places, much, much larger boards. But to be effective, the typical boards can be 7 to 9, maybe 11 people. They've all been very successful, and this brings with it some issues. If you're in a room full of 9 very successful people, my guess is most of those people are quite confident that they know how to make good decisions. And if you're in a room where people have different views on how to make decisions, it's more likely you're going to have conflict in that group. Another thing about small groups like boards of directors is that they are often very alike. If you remember when I said to you the Nomination Governance Committee chooses who to nominate for future board positions, well, this is no surprise to you. People choose people who are like them. They're more comfortable with that. So one of the big issues with boards is that they are often not particularly diverse. They're often very much alike, which leads to things like groupthink, often dismissive of the need for change, because things have been working so well so far. Why do we need to change? We find things that confirm our beliefs, that confirmation bias, I'm sure you're all familiar with. We might have institutional blindness because things have worked. We might become complacent because we're in a really good spot. And then we might suffer something called competitive fade, which every organization, every product, every business unit ultimately faces. If you're successful, you'll have competitors come in to do what you do better. You might become less efficient at what you're doing because you've been successful. So in a boardroom, this is a big problem. I'm sure can name companies that have gone away. One of the classic examples is Kodak, who used to be the leader and filmmaker and had the original patents on digital photography and dismissed it. They thought things wouldn't change. There are lots of examples like that. So boards can be viewed as one of the biggest sources of risk to organizations because of these factors that are here. So we want them to be more effective. Okay, so we're talking about risk, right? Risk is most likely to be framed as loss, even in the boardroom. As much as we're trying to teach people to think about it differently, typically people associate the word risk with loss. So in a second, I'll show you, and I'm sure you're familiar with some of this, how it impacts the way in which we make our decisions if we do that. We also see risk being talked about in boardrooms with outdated governance models. And just very quickly, I want to talk about a couple of these. If you've ever seen a probability and impact grid, it tries to map future risks or future potential losses based on their likelihood, usually low, medium, high probability, and their impact, low, medium, high impact. And people say, well, let's pay attention to the high probability, high impact events. It's a really outdated way of thinking about risk. There's something else called heat maps you see people talk about, where they try to plot risks that are emerging. They might be red, yellow, or green. So if they're red, you're going to pay more attention to them. These have all kinds of bias problems in them. People might not realize that risks can amplify and what it is that drives those. We'll talk in a second about this thing called the social amplification of risk. They might view risk as a compliance exercise, particularly if it's in an audit committee. So if it's an audit and risk committee, it's like, have we done X, Y, and Z? Which is not the living being of risk taking that we talk about. It's a compliance exercise. Tick the boxes. It's not a particularly effective approach. And in this environment today, typical governance models are not effective. They are too slow. They require too much top-down approval of policies and review. So this to me is something that says we really have to change the way in which we govern our risk-taking or our risk governance. And oftentimes we ignore that our decision-making is impacted by risks and our risk personalities. So if it's necessary, I think this is information we want to have. This slide's going to be really familiar to you guys. I'm sure that's been talked about already today. This obviously these crosshairs, these two axes come from PCL. So we appreciate us letting them use those. But this is something that goes back for me, again, 40 years, watching the way in which news or surprise impacts the way in which people respond. So when we work with board members, we focus on this fast emotional response and help them understand why that exists, but also that it's likely to interfere or even shut down their cognitive response. And remember, the top duty I told you about board members is to be strategic, to be thinking about the company's long term. And all of these risks that come at us are more likely to trigger that fast emotional response if we don't learn to embrace risk. And we want to avoid turning on that emotional response in people who are different from us and emphasize using the cognitive approach. So that's just one factor where risk is impacting our decision making. This social amplification of risk that I talked about before is also a well understood area in the psychology of risk. Why do some risks grow well beyond what their actual initial impact is? The financial crisis of 2008, 2009 is a great example of this. The early days of COVID are a great example of this. Well, it turns out there are two factors that matter. One, the level of dread that's perceived, and two, the level of knowledge or understanding that's perceived. It turns out you have to have a high level of dread and a high lack of knowledge for amplification to happen. So do people think experts don't understand what's going on? Do people think that this is going to hurt them personally, financially, their corporations? When those two factors are together, we can see amplification. Understanding that helps you also understand that you only need to address one of those two factors to avoid amplification. But if you don't talk about that in your board and the possible risks that you face and how they might amplify, you might not be addressing it properly. I think most of you guys are familiar with framing. And I like this example because I think it's very clear how this impacts the way in which we might decide things about our strategic plans. In this example, there's a director of health presented with two choices for treatment for something that's happening in this community of 600 people. If they choose the first one, they will surely save 200 people. If they choose the second approach, there's a 1/3 chance of saving everyone, a 2/3 chance that no one will be saved. Mathematically, anyone who works in probability knows that the expected value of these two choices is exactly the same. But 70% of people choose option one in the studies that have been done on this. That doesn't make sense unless you look at framing. Another way of framing it is to say that if you choose that first option, 400 people will surely die. And the second choice, 1/3 chance no one will die, 2/3 chance of saving everyone. The framing of this is negative. So 80% of people switch to option two. Mathematically, the expected value of all four of these is the same. We shouldn't see this kind of flipping. We shouldn't see a difference around 50% choice between the two, but we do. So we know, again, risk affects how we think and how we respond. So again, here's our famous axes, the two axes. Where is your risk personality? One of the things that Jeff and the team have shared with me that in the general population, and I don't remember the exact number, Anna and Jeff, what you guys have now. I think it's 40 to 50,000 people you have through your program. Roughly about 11% fall into each of these different categories. That's interesting to us because I have people tell me or ask me all the time when we run these programs, is there a better or worse risk personality type to have? And the answer is, well, if there was one that was better, I think over time evolution would have taken care of that. We'd see people clustered in particular categories, but we don't. So it's not that one is better or worse, but situationally or in different environments, one might be more prevalent and might be more effective. So for us, we work with board members. We work with C-suite executives. So our sample's biased. It's not a general population. These are people who are very successful. Certain risk personality types are overrepresented. Now, our data set's not as big. Our data set's between 200, 250 people because we've been running this now for, I think, a little over a year and a half with the team there. And what we find is that the composed risk personality type is almost double the likelihood, a little bit more than double the likelihood of the general population. The deliberate type also a little bit more than double. But if you look down at the bottom, the tense, excitable, and weary types are greatly underrepresented in these successful people. So that's interesting to us in terms of how people can move up that successful director hierarchy of needs. We're also looking at how boards become diverse or function well. So we work with groups sometimes. This is, I won't name the group, but this is a group we worked with recently where we had about 50, 55 members of that group take the initial board readiness assessment, or excuse me, take the risk personality assessment. And if you look at this, you can see they do not fall 11% in each category. Again, small sample size, so we could see small sample bias. But what we see across our data, and this is not that far off from what we've seen in other groups that we've worked with, is that the composed risk personality type is most dominant. Deliberate, adventurous axial types tend to be overrepresented. In this group, there were more excitable types than we've seen in our overall data set. But what we tend to see is that people in our C-suite board member database are drawn down on the scale of the emotional response, away from the intense response to the more composed response. They're in the middle on the cognitive approach, which I think is a good sign of some diversity on that. But we don't see them have intense emotional responses very often. When we look at this entire group, this one group that we were working with, the center of gravity for this group, so the collective risk personality of everybody in the room when we had this event, is composed right on the edge of the axial type. For our entire data set, 200, 250 data points, we see the exact same thing. So when we see that board members and C-suite executives tend to fall in this composed category close to the axial type, we're actually pretty comfortable with that. I think that's a good place for us to be overall. But then we also want to be aware of how individual boards of much smaller groups might be impacted by the people who are on their boards. Now, this is 7 people from that group. Remember, that group is all successful C-suite executives and board members. You could very easily choose these 7 people to serve on your board of directors and be quite happy with who you have. You'd look at their backgrounds, you'd look at their resumes, and you'd say, this is an outstanding group. I'm very excited to work with them. But they also have a collective personality. So we have composed people like we would expect. We have an adventurous person here. We have 3 excitable people and an axial type. Overall, this group is carefree. Now, maybe that's what this organization wants. If this is an entrepreneurial startup, if this is an entity that's interested in experimentation, trying things fast, that might be the right mix. But if this is a mining company or a company that's concerned with safety, it's probably not where they want to be. But they may not know this because they haven't done this sort of profiling. So again, that question back to whether there is a personality type that's best. The answer I usually give is no, but the mix that you have will help determine who you might bring on next. So we don't ever recommend to a nomination governance committee that you solely use a risk personality to decide whether someone should come onto your board. But if you're considering 3 candidates, for example, and it's difficult to decide between them, you might look at what is their risk personality type and how is it going to impact us? Are they lower on that emotional scale so that they bring to calming influences in time of crisis? Will they be opposed personalities, which I'm sure you guys have talked about? Greater sources of conflict come from we have risk personalities that are opposite of each other, particularly in stressful environments. So if it's an opposed personality to people you have on the board, is that a good thing? Well, it can be less impactful if you have an axial type. So that axial type has parts of everybody else's personality, act as a bridge, act as an influence that can bring people together. If you're missing that, you're more likely to have conflict. So we like to talk to people about having axial types being chairs of committees or chairs of boards, or at least having one on the board that can help bring people together. If you do not have enough different personalities, you're not going to see risk problems in the same way, or you will see risk problems in the same way. You won't see enough different solutions or enough different ideas around innovation. So we also want to see a diversity. At the same time, we don't want to see so much scattered diversity that we can't come together to work. But it's important to have some diversity on the board, and particularly in some of our committee work, we want to have that diversity. And remember that even though we can be variable situationally, we do eventually revert to our dots under stress. And when there's this stress, we want to be aware of who's in the room with us, who we are, and how we avoid triggering the emotional response that shuts down our cognitive strategic response. Again, this is the notion of learning to embrace risk. So we have all of these different risk personality types and all those different risk committees. I'm not going to go through each one with you on this, but if you're thinking about an audit committee, you're probably going to be wanting prudent people. You're probably not going to be wanting carefree and adventurous people. Again, remember, it's about validating. It's about being detail-oriented, about being in compliance. On an innovation committee, for example, you might not want a bunch of wary people who are always looking at things going wrong, or intense people. That might not be the right mix, but you still want to have adventurous, carefree, composed people, a nice diversity to consider things in new ways. And we could say that same thing about risk committees. And in terms of communicating out who we are as an organization, organizations will often put out something called a risk appetite statement, which is supposed to communicate how they feel about risk. But if the center of gravity of your board is different from what you're telling people your risk appetite is, the CEO of the organization is going to get on paper what you say and observe conversation that's quite different. And that creates a dissonance, or can create a dissonance in the organization that carries through. So let's look at diversity and why it's important to us, not just, in terms of the normal types of diversity, but risk personality diversity. We see better problem solving. We see more robust strategic planning discussions because people see things from different ways. There are people who will raise issues of concern. There are people who will be ready to move forward. There will be people who have novel ideas because the others in the room don't think that way. We think this is incredibly important, particularly in this environment of rapid change. We see risk differently because of our experiences and because of how we're wired. If we have that diversity, particularly if you have something like an axial type in the room, we're going to be less likely to trigger these emotional responses. If we understand everyone else that's in the room and their different risk personality types, we can speak to them and address the concerns that they're likely to have. Or in the case of somebody who's overly concerned, be welcoming of people who embrace risk taking without the same level of apparent thought that they might have. And it's going to help us to reduce all those biases that I'd mentioned. So all of these things combined together make it more likely we can fulfill that duty of care, which ultimately, again, that's what a board's responsibility is, to care for the organization so that it's doing the best it can do to fulfill the goals of the organization, of the owners, of the founders, of the funders, whoever it might be. And as you guys know in the room, I'm sure risk personalities are almost always unknown. So Jeff, everybody on the team there, we're trying to do our part to make sure that the world understands the impact of these risk personalities. There's a long way to go. But again, there's nothing that touches board decision-making more than risk. So understanding these risk personalities is incredibly important. So with that, if you ever need to contact me, the slide, I think that Anna's going to share these with you. My contact information is there. The website for our organization is there if you want to learn more about what we're doing.